So we'll move to our last speaker of this session, who is Andrew Morrall. You've already heard him speak today. He's professor at Bard Graduate Center, and he's written widely on the arts of early modern Northern Europe, art and the Reformation, the history of collecting, intersections of art and science, theories of ornament, and the early modern domestic interior. His publications include Jörg Brau the Elder, Art, Culture, and Belief in Reformation Augsburg, which was published in 2002, and the exhibition and catalog with Melinda Watt, Twixt Art and Nature, English Embroidery from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1580 to 1700, that was published in 2008, and numerous articles, including most recently The Reception of Dürer and His Art in Early 16th Century Venice, which is in the exhibition catalog for the exhibit on Albrecht Dürer at the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt, which closed in February of this year. And also Object, Material, Myth, Ovidian Poetics and Natural Philosophy in the 16th Century Northern European Kunstkammer, in The Challenge of the Object, which was published in 2013. His recent research focuses on works of art and craft made for Kunstkammer of 16th century Northern Europe, and in particular on the educational background and knowledge base of the craftsmen who made them, whose interests intersected with those of their courtly patrons, and whose creations gave material shape to the philosophical speculations and scientific inquiries about the world that arose within the Kunstkammer's milieu. Today, he will be talking to us about table talk, inscriptional wisdom, and the domestic arts in early modern Northern Europe. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Morrall.
Right, do I just... Okay, I can just do it here, can't I? Ah. Seem to have lost my title, but never mind. Thank you, Abby, for your lovely introduction, and thank you to all for coming. This talk will investigate the habit among 16th and 17th century Northern European householders of decorating their walls and domestic furnishings with inscriptions, usually in the form of a brief adage, proverb, or biblical injunction. Such inscriptions were everywhere, on tablewares, drinking vessels, wooden platters, silver dishes, stove tiles, wall paintings, and so forth. And so what I want to do is to consider some of the ways such texts functioned within the wider context of domestic display and suggest how they were intended to act upon the beholder. So we might begin with the evidence of a painting. The portrait of the Augsburg artist Hans Burgmeier the Elder and his wife Anna, painted by Laux Furtnagel in 1527, is shocking in its portrayal of a couple contemplating their mortality in starkly physical terms. Of interest to the present purpose is the fact that the mirror is inscribed O Mors, O Death, on the top, and Erkenn dich selbst, Know Thyself, on the forward edge. And we have the possibility that this inscribed mirror, if we take seriously that this inscribed mirror actually belonged to the couple, and that their contemplation of it was therefore not simply a pictorial trope, but reflects an actual meditational practice, then the skulls that emerge dimly within the glass like ghostly apparitions are the reifications of inner sight, a vision that's been summoned by the sitter's meditations upon the inscriptions around the mirror's rim, which are both invocatory, O death, O Mors, and exhortatory, Erkenn dich selbst, Know Thyself. A further inscription, which is just on the right, you can barely make it out on the top right, painted flat on the picture surface, and therefore abstracted from the internal narrative of the picture, serves as the couple's own commentary upon their action. And it says in translation, we are both nothing more than the forms in the mirror. So both the picture's internal dynamics, what they're actually doing, and its broader emblematic meaning are thus generated by inscriptions written upon an actual mirror frame. The probability that the mirror actually belonged to them is supported by another demonstrable personal possession within the painting. This is the signet ring that Burgmeier wears on his left hand, and which his sweeping gesture presents to the viewer's attention. Though it's today not sufficiently clear to be part of the painting's broader meaning, we know its character because it still exists in the Bayerische Nationalmuseum in Munich. And it bears the coat of arms of Borgmeier, around which, on the setting of the bezel, engraved in black enamel is the inscription "Mors vincit," or "Death triumphs." So by the shape of the ring, death, materialized in script, literally encircles the heraldic figure of the man and enjoins him to look to the end, to know himself indeed. The same injunction to know thyself was found in the will of a yeoman farmer from Yorkshire, northern England, Nicholas Feney, recently discussed by Juliet Fleming, who in 1617 left his son, and I quote, "my signet or rine of gold having these letters, NF, for my name thereon engraven, with this notable posy about the same letters, viz. Nosce te ipsum, know thyself, to the intent that my son, William Feney, in the oft beholding and considering of that worthy posy, may be better out in mind of himself and of his estate." So such testimony bears witness to the value and importance that such inscribed possessions could assume in people's lives. And it's worth emphasizing at this point that in all three instances considered so far, the inscription gathers metaphorical force by its relationship to its material base. In the case of Borgmeier's ring, the idea of the inevitability of death encircling the individual is enacted physically by the text following the circular shape of the ring, while in the case of the mirror, the illusory and insubstantial nature of the reflective surface provides a material metaphor for the recognition, know thyself, of the sitter's own glassy essence. The motto, Nosce te ipsum, know thyself, also forms the subject of one of Erasmus's adages, the compilation of mottos and aphorisms and proverbs that he collated throughout his career. Erasmus notes that it was found written over the doors of the Temple of Delphi, and he underlines the authority of the saying by quoting its usage by a series of classical and early Christian authors, from Plato to Macrobius. Erasmus himself gives the saying a broadly Stoic interpretation when he asserts that it, quote, recommends moderation and bids us not to pursue objects either too great for us or beneath us. So we have three quite different contexts and usages, local, literary, elite, that have prompted quite different understandings and uses of the same phrase. Collectively, nonetheless, these inscriptions belong to a recognized register in the realm of 16th century language, that is, the sententia, the adage or proverb whose concentrated form was weighted with an authority that lay often in the presumption of long transmission and an obscure origin. In the adages, Erasmus calls such aphorisms symbols in which ancient wisdom was contained. And it's often precisely their lack of a traceable source and their antiquity that gave them their authority as universal truths. Erasmus quotes Juvenal as saying of the proverb Nosce te ipsum that it descended from the sky like an oracle. Yet even as Erasmus acknowledges this transcendent sense of origin, his own treatment of the saying in effect historicizes it by tracing its usage through a series of classical and ancient authorities. This habit of placing such moral sententiae or commonplaces strategically on personal possessions and household furnishings undoubtedly gained impetus from the Reformation mistrust of images and a concomitant emphasis accorded the word in Protestant thought. Above all, however, it was the educational agenda of humanists and reformers across the confessional divide that encouraged the practice on didactic and pedagogical grounds. Exemplary and admonitory inscriptions and images were constantly before the eyes as a means of instilling virtue and morality into the household, and particularly children. In his instructions on the education of the young prince, Erasmus urged just such a judicious use of inscriptions, images, and material objects to inculcate awareness of the virtues of the young child. And I'll just show you a drawing, a design by Hans Postheimer of it's a kind of a pendant, penknife really, with various tools. But the inscription there is the word of God lives forever. But Erasmus, urging the use of inscriptions, says they must be fixed in his mind, pressed in, rammed home, the mind of the child, and they must be kept fresh in the memory in all sorts of ways, sometimes in a moral maxim, sometimes in a parable, sometimes by an analogy, sometimes by a live example. They must be carved on rings, painted in pictures, inscribed on prizes, and presented in any other way that a child of his age enjoys, so that they are always before him, his mind, even when he's doing something else. Erasmus was a highly influential source of this idea of inscriptional decoration, and he gives the form exemplary, or he gives the idea exemplary literary form in his Convivium Religiosum, or this godly feast of 1522. This popular dialogue describes a luncheon party of humanist friends who congregate at the country house of Eusebius, their learned host. And the house's decoration is described in elaborate detail. Every room or doorway, and I'll just show you a kind of archaeological example of the kind of thing, is every room and doorway on walls, in galleries and garden flower beds and on fountains, there are speaking inscriptions and images that engage the guests, who read the mottos and take note of the images and emblems and draw moral lessons from them. The inscriptions are biblical. The emblems likewise orient guests towards things spiritual. So, for instance, the garden fountain points to the fountain of life. A polluted stream at the bottom of the garden symbolizes the dangers of corrupting the pure source of Scripture, and so on. As Terence Cave has shown, Erasmus is here employing an elaborate form of energeia, the rhetorical evocation of place. But nonetheless, the idea of a speaking environment as something almost living and breathing didn't exist solely as a humanist literary creation, but was carried on into actual houses. And there is a great deal of sort of literary and archaeological evidence to support this. Erasmus's great friend Johann von Botzheim's house in Constance is described as an abode of the muses by Erasmus. His friend John Colet in Sheen, just outside London, also his house was full of painted images and figures. Henry Peacham describes Arundel House in the 17th century as the chief English scene of ancient inscriptions. You shall find on the walls of the house inlaid with them and speaking Greek and Latin to you. The garden especially will afford you the pleasure of a world of learned lectures of this kind. And I'm showing you here just two details of fragments of what was the wall of a solarium, the upper story of a house of a merchant in late Elizabethan Thame in Oxfordshire, in the High Street, where we have quotations from St. Paul. I'm sorry they're so blurred, and quotations ascribed to Pythagoras and Aristotle, cheek by jowl, in this quite interesting way. I've got a little translation. I don't know if you can make it out. How then were such inscriptions apprehended and used? The humanist Thomas Eliot gave a very explicit sense of the different ways such written inscriptions and images might act upon the beholder. In the book named The Governor, he closely echoed Erasmus when he advised the wise householder to paint some monument of virtue on his walls, quote, whereby other men in beholding may be instructed, or at least ways to virtue be persuaded. And likewise, his plate and vessel would be engraved with histories, fables, or quick and wise sentences, comprehending good doctrine or counsels, whereby one of these commodities may happen, either that they which do eat and drink, having those wisdoms ever in sight, shall happen with the meat to receive some of them, or by purposing them at the table, may suscitate some disputation or reasoning. So beyond straightforward visual instruction, the presence of inscriptions might have two further desired consequences. Their speaking presence might create an atmosphere of sober piety, such as to inculcate virtue even as one ate, and secondly, they could be props to stimulate pious conversation. We find a late example of this first usage in a description of a country parson's house by the English poet divine George Herbert, wherein, quote, even the walls are not idle, but something is written and painted there which may excite the reader to a thought of piety, especially the 101st Psalm, which is expressed in a fair table as being the rule of the family. The presence of Psalm 101, particularly the second verse, I will behave in a perfect way. O when wilt thou come unto me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart, is both prescriptive and invocatory, serving an almost liturgical purpose to evoke the sense of Christ's actual presence within the room. This, in a sense, is to echo the spirit of Erasmus's Holy Feast, where the written sentences on the wall and on wine glasses are combined at the beginning of the meal with a reading out of a passage from Scripture, to ensure, as Eusebius the host says, that we make ourselves readier for so great a guest, that Christ may mingle with all our food and drink, so that everything may taste of him, but most of all, that he may penetrate our hearts. Evidence for such a desired sacramental presence in amidst the everyday is garnered from a number of family portraits, in which family members are shown at table. In this painting of the family of the Basel goldsmith, Hans Rudolf Fesch, painted in 1559 by Hans Hug Kluber, an inscribed tablet, unfortunately illegible, stands at the top right, is on the wall behind the family group at dinner. This is combined with an intimation of the unseen presence of Christ in their midst, symbolized by the empty place setting in the lower foreground. Luxuriously laid out with an expensive set of knife, fork, and spoon in a little etui. To the left, a small and interestingly old-fashioned 15th century Gothic wine decanter serves perhaps as the container for the better wine, reserved, as Hans-Peter Lanzer suggested, for the guest of honor. Together with the loaf of bread on the right, the reference to the Last Supper is unmistakable and is intended to evoke the familiar saying of Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. A decorative wall tablet containing a written inscription. Just to go on to another family portrait, this time from of the Bürgermeister of Zurich, Hans Conrad Bodmer, and his family in 1643. We have another inscription on the right edge. And of course, this is a wonderful painting that exemplifies the Protestant use of pious decoration, from glass roundels to the virtues adorning the stove. But placed on the right, behind the stove, and today in rather rubbed condition, it reads in translation, "In the hot stove of our afflictions, God tests his children. O Jesus Christ, protect us from the fires of hell with your hard-won blood." Cheerful stuff. The saying, based on such biblical foundations as Isaiah 48:10, "Behold, I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction," plays with the experience of heat and sweating, and here specifically in the inscription evokes the fear of hell. So regarded in the light of Sir Thomas Eliot's prescriptions, or of the experience of the guests in Erasmus's Holy Feast, one can begin to understand how such biblical metaphor would have hovered over and mingled with this physical environment, infusing it with a sense of holy immanence and charging the atmosphere with a force of holy injunction. Such painted spaces help us reimagine the original context of inscriptions that are frequently found decorating molded waistbands of stoneware drinking vessels and jugs, especially the so-called Bartmannskrüge, bulbous stoneware beer jugs decorated at the neck with an applied molded relief of a bearded face. Many of these inscriptions are biblical quotations or pious injunctions. For instance, on the left-hand side here, we have "the word of God standeth forever," invoking Isaiah 48, and another on the right, "Eat and drink in the knowledge of God. Drink und esst, Gottes nicht vergesst," and so on and so forth. Here we have tangible survivals of the disembodied voices that approximate, anyway, the disembodied voices that speak to Erasmus's guests through the written messages that surround them. The beer jug's serial method of manufacture, often on a scale large enough to serve foreign markets, moreover, points to a wide dissemination of this form of domestic piety. And as Juliet Fleming, who we will hear from later, has discussed wonderfully in her book on graffiti, like the inscribed wall panel of the Bodmer family house, these kinds of utterance issuing forth from the matter of the clay pot have the effect, in a sense, of destabilizing the physical realm by breaking down the boundaries between literal and metaphorical apprehension, between physical pot and disembodied speaking presence. The inscribed thought proceeds from no originating human or subjective source. It's quite exteriorized, disembodied, and exists as a kind of discrete entity, given form and script, and called into being by its material continuum. So the pot becomes literally a bearer of transcendental value. The thought is bound in its matter. The matter is imbued with the spirit of the thought. The text of the inscription here acts much more than a transparent sign. It is bound, it must be apprehended via the senses as much as purely by the intellect. So the meaning lies in the fact of its embeddedness, if you like, in matter. And that sort of sense of the kind of interlocutory sense that these pots can have, I thought this slide summed up quite nicely. So thus far we have found evidence that inscriptions were used didactically and effectively to instruct or to evoke divine presence or to act in combination with their material carriers as bearers of disembodied wisdom. What of the further, more proactive use suggested by Thomas Eliot's description, that they may suscitate some disputation or reasoning? How might quick and wise sentences of this sort stimulate virtuous conversation? And what form might these conversations take? To reconstruct the character of this form of pious intercourse, one has to start, I think, by looking more closely at the place of the sententia in 16th century educational and cultural life. And I'd ask you to bear with me here. For ultimately, the taste for this inscriptional mode of decoration and its ethical orientation was a consequence of a particular humanist method of teaching how to read classical texts, which emphasized the collecting and memorization of fragments of useful phrases. Schoolboys were introduced to sententiae in their very first Latin exercises, in textbooks like the Distichs of Cato or the Sententiae Pueriles, which consisted of elementary sentences that were used to learn the basics of vocabulary and syntax, but which were also intended to be morally useful to the pupils. The earliest phrases in the Sententia Pueriles are made up of only two words: amicis opitulare, help your friends; arcanum cela, keep a secret, down to the now familiar cognosce te ipsum at the bottom, know thyself. At a more advanced stage, the student would be required to compile a commonplace book into which he would write sententiae, aphorisms, proverbs, and stories drawn from his reading, carefully chosen for their rhetorical elegance and moral usefulness. These would be placed under discrete headings that were usually concerned with moral topics, such as prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and so forth. In this way, the commonplace method encouraged a form of ethically directed reading, even as it broke down the text into a personal collection of elegant and rhetorically useful quotations. More generally, it encouraged rhetorical habits of thought and reasoning centered upon the commonplace that carried on into adult life. Peter Mack has demonstrated how at every stage of Latin instruction, grammar and rhetoric were integrally tied to moral precept. And he makes the important point that once selected and recording, the useful and pleasing sentence was then reused and reinforced in more advanced composition exercises. And he cites an exercise called the Crea, which is found in Apthonis's Pragymnasmata, a textbook which, in translation by Agricola and Loricius, was one of the most often printed in the 16th century. So in essence, the Crea, this exercise, presents a saying or an action as a model for imitation. And it consists of building up a rounded argument by subjecting a noteworthy statement to 8 stages of deliberation. So these 8 stages are praise of the person speaking or acting, an explanation of what is said and done, an argument from the cause, a contrary argument, a comparison, an example, an opinion of the ancients, and an epilogue. So quite a complicated schoolboy exercise, if you like, or student exercise. So while serving as a useful training in the use of language and rhetorical amplification, the exercise also, by its nature, necessitated thinking around a chosen commonplace and successfully constructing a moral argument. Training in rhetorical method, therefore, carried within it the possibility of advancing ethical thinking by establishing a form of dialectical reasoning around the opposite or varying views of different authorities. One might expect to find such habits of rhetorical elaboration around a received commonplace that was rehearsed repeatedly in the classroom and forming the basis of oral and written argument, carried on into the patterns of adult life and informing the structures of educated discourse, not least the kind we've seen centered around inscriptions. And indeed, one can discover traces of such table talk frozen within the forms of certain dining accoutrements. A set of 12 wooden fruit trenchers dating in the Metropolitan Museum, dating from the late 16th or early 17th century, provides a case in point. In early modern England, fruit trenchers were used at the dessert course of a meal, that's to say the recreational part, supposedly serving to hold fruit or sweetmeats. They were typically thin wooden roundels or rectangular-shaped platters, as here, painted with proverbs or sayings drawn from all kinds of sources, vernacular, classical, biblical, often filled with humorous folk wisdom, rhyming verses about the battle of the sexes or the pleasures and pains of married life. And usually, each of this set of 12 trenchers is replete with numerous biblical quotations from the Old and New Testaments and the Apocrypha, and each of the trenchers addresses a different area of moral life. These include self-knowledge, the need for repentance, the need to guard against covetousness, against lust, bad language, anger, and so forth. In this example, the quotations are collectively centered upon the fact of human mortality, each one prompting a slightly different direction of thought. In this one. So the central inscription reads, "Set an order in thy house, for thou shalt die and not live. For the truth strive unto death, and God shall fight for thee against thine enemies. Be faithful unto they which die in the Lord." And then there are others around the edges. "Do good or thou die. Remember the end, or thou shalt never do amiss." Really cheerful after dinner conversation. "Death is better than a wretched life of continual sickness," and so forth. The structure of the trencher, though, and there's just another detail, reflects the form of the typical commonplace book in its compilation of pithy texts relating to a common theme. And indeed, the conceit is intentional, for the collection of trenchers is actually in a container formed as a book. There it is. So that the contents literally reflect the culled and collated flowers of rhetoric or flowers of wisdom of the commonplace method. What makes the trenchers uniquely significant is their functional character. Because they were intended to be put to use in a social context as stimuli to debate or rumination, they form a very concrete bridge between the commonplace book and the lost habits of Elizabethan conversation. Though we don't know precisely how they were used at table, it's clear from their form that each quotation would allow elaboration in a slightly different direction around a central theme, perhaps thus to provoke discursive discussion. It's certainly highly unusual among the surviving sets of these trenchers, and probably reflects quite a theologically sophisticated milieu. We can turn quickly again to Erasmus's guests in his religious feast for insight into the mechanics of just such a conversation. As the guests assemble for the meal, one of them says, "So far from silent is your house that not only the walls but the cup too says something." And the host says, "What does it tell you?" And Sophronius says, "Mine speaks Greek. In wine there's truth." To which Eusebius replies, "A warning that it's not safe for priests and servants of the king to be fond of wine," and so on. Sophronius then provides an exemplum in the form of a historical anecdote about Egyptian priests, and then Eusebius counters this by generalizing the point by posing a topical question. Everyone's allowed to drink nowadays. Whether this is wise or not, I don't know. This then leads to a detailed set of deliberations back and forth that involves quotations from Proverbs and Corinthians and St. Matthew and so forth. So in this manner, from the wine cup's simple inscriptions, and I think I've got a wine cup there, suitably inscribed. From the wine cup's simple inscriptions, there develops an extended exchange of deliberations. And from this, a general and important theme emerges, which in this case is the true nature of Christian liberty. But the point is, in a manner akin to the school exercise in rhetoric, a series of sophisticated moral speculations is thus produced by a process of rhetorical amplification around received commonplaces and texts. The dialogue thus reveals an attitude to the inscribed saying quite different from the effective and invocatory usages that I've looked at above or previously, one that arguably was to lead to the eventual shift in the ontological status of the sententia. For as a consequence of this conversational mode of subjecting the received saying to a series of opposite and varied points of view and holding up to scrutiny its ethical implications, this was to call into question the definitive, sort of transcendent nature of its authority, which we found in those other pieces. Above all, it is to see how habits of rhetorical expression learned early on came to frame patterns of thought and consequent structures of social discourse, and found material embodiment in these inscriptional schemes. At their most sophisticated, and there are other schemes one could discuss, such inscriptions don't merely reflect social practice, but were active agents, vital in a process by which ethical thinking and self-knowledge might be advanced. Thank you very much. Nice. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite all of the speakers from this panel to come up and sit at the table, and we'll have some questions before we break for lunch.